Want to welcome everybody today. I'm Debbie Nicole. I am a Kent County Master Gardener and also the chairperson of the workshop committee. So I was thinking about my title of this class, and I was thinking that we could just as easily have called this garden survival skills, because that's basically what we're talking about today. We're talking about, in the face of all these things that are happening to our climate, how are we going to adapt? How are we going to make changes in how we garden in our own house in order for our garden and our plants and our insects to survive these changes? So this is a gardening class. We're not going to be discussing whether or not climate change is happening. We're going to assume, if you're here, that you don't deny that climate change is real. So the point is not to discuss the causes of climate change, whether they're occurring due to human actions or something else. Our primary goal is not to tell you how you can perform actions or activities to slow or mitigate climate change, although the small things recommended here can certainly help. We're here to talk about the things that you can do in your own home garden to adapt to these changes that are happening. So our workshop today is going to address a wide range of topics. So we hope we can give you a few ideas of things that you can do in your own garden. So briefly, I want to go over a review of what's actually happening. So this is data that was put together by our Delaware State climatologist, Dr. Daniel Leathers. As you can see, it's still a little bit behind. It only goes up to 2019. So potentially it could have even gotten worse than that. I don't know. I don't have the exact data, and I'm a data person. I like numbers. So you can see from the graph, the red line is the line of best fit to this data, shows how the temperatures have been increasing since 1985 up through 2019. So this is a fact. This is real. This is data that's been collected. As a result of this, our growing zones, these are the USDA growing plant hardiness zones, have shifted northward. So the growing zones are what zone you're in is based on your annual minimum temperatures. And you can see the annual minimum temperatures have been going up. If you look at the map, it's obvious that the hotter areas, the 8s and 9s, are creeping up. And in the northern part, you can see the zone 3s up there in the upper Midwest are also shrinking. So that's what's happening to growing zones. And I found this image, which is a prediction of how much they're going to change in the future. So you can see that every 18 years, they're showing what it is now and what they're predicted to be in 2040. So in 18 years' time, they're predicting these places, not every place, but a lot of places, these particular cities are all going to go up one number in zone. So in Dover, Delaware, we're currently in zone 7. By 2040, only 18 years from now, we're predicted to be in zone 8. So the other thing about this is they're finding that zones are traveling at a rate, moving north at a rate of 13 miles per decade. So that's how they're coming up with this future plan. So over the next 13 years, it'll go up. Over the next 18 years, it'll go up 13 miles. This is a graph also put together by the Delaware State climatologist that shows the increase in annual precipitation in Delaware from 1895 up till 2018. And as you can see, it's not anywhere near as dramatic as the increase in temperatures, but it is a slight increase, and this does have an effect, especially with us in Delaware being so close to the coast. So that's what's going on with that. And of course, this one only goes up to 2018. As we know, the annual participation, I'm not sure if it's been increasing a lot since then, but we know it's been more erratic. We're seeing more extremes, and we'll talk about that some more in a minute. The big concern we have in Delaware is rising sea levels. This graphic shows what happens when sea levels rise and you get the saltwater intrusion coming in to the land. So the sea is moving up, you get more tidal flooding, you get water coming in underground, you get soggy soils, and you also get salt contaminated soils. So how is this going to affect what we can grow? I don't personally live right at the coast, but some of you may, and you may find that you have to change your gardening habits because your soil is getting too salty or too wet. That's a major concern of farmers also. We're mostly talking about small home gardeners here, but of farmers and what's happening. So sea levels are expected to rise 1 foot by 2050, which is as much over the next 30 years as happened over the last century. So it's happening a lot faster. Damaging floods. This is really a concern on the east and Gulf Coast primarily right now. The flooding, of the tidal flooding coming in from the ocean. Another not so fun fact is that comes from NOAA, that if all the ice on the Earth, all the ice that they're seeing melting now in Greenland and Antarctica, if all that were to melt, which is not predicted to happen at all right now, then the sea level would actually rise 216 feet. So they've gone out and calculated the volume of water that would be created by all that ice melting. Well, if the sea level rises 216 feet, you can, this is a really cool thing. If you have an iPhone, you can go to the compass on your iPhone and it'll tell you what elevation you're at. And I checked mine and I'm at 40 feet above sea level. Well, where am I going to be if the water rises 216 feet? So that's something to think about. All of Delaware is below 216 feet would be covered. In addition to, and I'm sure you guys have heard in the news about California and how they're expecting the whole Central Valley, where I used to live in Sacramento, to become an inland lake, giant inland lake or sea eventually. Because when I lived in Sacramento, we were about at sea level, even though we had mountains on both sides. So it was a valley. So let's see. Extreme weather events. So what's been happening to these weather events? Well, we've always had all these events, always. The thing is that they are becoming more intense and happening more frequently. So these climate-related disasters have actually increased 83% over the last 20 years. One of the things on this list, I'll give you a quiz right now. One of these extreme weather events on this list, they have not linked to climate change. One of these things happens, but it's not linked to climate change. Anybody want to guess what it is? You can put in the chat box, or we only have a few people here, so if you want to unmute and guess which of these is not linked to climate change. Anybody?
Wildfires?
Wind?
Nope. They're all kind of interrelated because wildfires are related to drought. So you get droughts and a combination of droughts and wind, then you can get wildfires. Any other guesses before I tell you?
Hurricanes?
No, hurricanes are definitely increasing. The warming seas is causing the hurricanes and the tidal flooding to become more intense. And that the warming seas is directly related to climate change.
Tornadoes.
You are correct. It is tornadoes. So tornadoes themselves have not been correlated to climate change at this point. Very good. That everything else on this list is related to climate change and somewhat related to each other, as we've said. Okay, now we're going to talk about insects. in some places, some kinds of insects have decreased in half and cut absolutely in half. As you can see from this graph here, the Lepidoptera, which is our moths and butterflies and things, have decreased, not quite by half, but some of the other insects have, erratically decreased. And a lot of these might be our beneficial insects. And what's causing them to go away? Well, a really big important factor is climate change with extreme heat and just the conditions under which they're used to living changing. But also agriculture, which takes away their natural habitats, pesticides, which of course is linked to agriculture, habitat loss, pollution, forest fires that burn their habitats, and extreme weather events, which can kill the insects. And then a lot of it is related to climate change. But on the other hand, other kinds of insects have been increasing. These are usually the insects that we consider pests. They have shorter lives. So what's happening as it gets warmer, it's all influenced by it getting warmer. We can see like perhaps there was a species of insect that normally had 2 generations. So they would come out in the spring, you'd have one generation, they would lay their eggs, and you'd have a second generation, and then the eggs would stay in the soil over the winter for the next year. So you would have 2 generations and all those crops that they're eating and munching on over 2 generations. Well, with it getting warmer and spring coming earlier and fall lasting later, we could have 3 generations. That 3 generations is more bugs. Expansion of geographic range, as you can see on this graphic, they're moving north. I warned all my friends in Canada that these bugs are coming. They're headed this way. Because that's what they'll do. They'll migrate to a habitat that suits what they're used to better. So when you have some of these weather conditions that we have, excessive heat and humidity, if you've been outside lately, the humidity out there is pretty bad. You will see that with humidity we get more fungus, we get other diseases that are transmitted by insects, and the more insects you have, the more plant disease problems you could have. Also, overwintering, if it doesn't get cold enough in the winter, some of these insects that possibly died out with the first freeze or frost may be able to survive. And then also desynchronization. So if you look in this graphic, there's a ladybug and maybe some aphids. Well, what happens if their timing is off because of the seasons changing, and the aphids come out at a time when there's no ladybugs, and there's no ladybugs to manage that population? So that's what we mean about desynchronization, that they're not, the good bugs are not out there at the same time as the bad bugs that they're supposed to be managing for us. So that's another thing. And then you have your loss of synchronicity with the host plant. So say you're a pollinator and you came out early because it got warm, but the flowers that you want to pollinate and the pollen you need is not available because that hasn't come out yet. So the desynchronization is also affecting the insect populations. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat of stuff. What we're talking about generally here is sustainability. We're talking about being able to get our gardens to survive in our natural environment. And when our natural environment changes, we need to change our habits to be able to sustain our gardens and to survive. So that's basically what we're talking about here. And one of the most important sustainable gardens that I've ever heard of is called permaculture. So it's basically when you stop fighting nature and go with the flow. Work with nature, work with your natural environment and what's around in your yard. If it's a hill or a stream or a forest, work with that instead of against it, and you'll have more success. So now you're asking, what can I do? What am I supposed to be doing to help my garden? I want to know what to do to provide food for my family. So, are you asking yourself, do I know what I'm going to do if my plants suffer from the heat? What will I do if we get an extended period of drought? What will I do if we get extended periods of rain and flash floods? How can I keep my trees, flowers, and edible garden healthy? How will I be able to afford to buy groceries if the prices keep going up? How will I be able to afford plant and lawn fertilizers? How can I make sure that my food that I'm growing now is going to last me through the winter? Okay, what can I do? What can I do to save myself money, to make sure I have food, and also at the same time take care of my environment and protect what we have for our kids and our grandkids? So, let's talk about growing our own food. I know not everybody is a vegetable gardener or a fruit gardener. A lot of people grow ornamental stuff, which is awesome because all those flowers feed our pollinators, which will go fly over to people's vegetable gardens and make food. But if you want to, if you choose to, and you like to grow your own food, it gives you a nice feeling, a kind of a survival skill feeling, a feeling of self-sufficiency, because you know, if you know how to grow food, then you know that you can always find out a way to eat. So it's a good reason to start a vegetable garden if you haven't done that yet, or grow fruits. Another important thing that happens when you have your own vegetable garden is when you think about it, all of these vegetables, if you go to the grocery store and you look at those little stickers that, that it's grown in California or it's grown in Mexico, how do all those vegetables get to our grocery stores? Well, they come in trucks. And what do the trucks do? They use gasoline and they pollute the air. So if you're growing your own food or buying local or getting food from a community garden, you're helping reduce your carbon footprint because you're helping to cut out some of those transportation costs that are contributing to climate change. In addition, we're going to talk in a minute about lawns, but the bigger your vegetable garden is, the less lawn you have to take care of. Of course, you still do have to take care of that vegetable garden. It does save money. If you notice, the prices in stores are getting crazy ridiculous. If you grow your own food, and if you are able to save your seeds and you don't have to buy seeds, and compost to make your own fertilizer, you're pretty much providing for yourself at very, very little expense. So it does save a lot of money. Fresh foods are very much healthier for you. They retain their nutrients. If you go out, I grow a lot of greens and lettuces, and we go out there when I'm ready to have a salad, cut those leaves and eat that salad 5 minutes after that plant was cut. And it's so much more flavorful, and the nutrients are retained because it was just picked. So those are some good reasons to think about growing your own food. So how do you go about growing your own food in the face of climate change? Even if you've been growing your own food, there may be some changes that you have to make because the conditions are changing. So one thing you can do is think about using more container gardening. The good thing about container gardening, for one, you can better control the water and the soil that they're growing in. You can also control the shade and the heat that they're receiving by actually moving that container around. So a lot of vegetables and fruits will grow quite well in containers. You also see in the picture here we have somebody's growing some greens and things in raised beds that they have setting up close to their house. So raised beds are great because, again, you can control the soil. You can put them in places like they have them sitting not on a lawn but on looks like just a mulched area. And the drainage that you can control if you get a big flood or standing water in your lawn, especially if you have tomatoes. You know that is not good for those things to be sitting in water. If you have a raised bed, you can keep your plants with proper drainage, keep your plants higher up and out of the water. In addition, a longer summer season means more growing days, which means you may be able to grow things that you never thought about growing before, things that require a longer growing season. I'm going to talk about sweet potatoes in a minute, but I am a sweet potato grower. And in the past, sweet potatoes didn't grow in Delaware because they need about 100, 120 days from planting to harvest. And that's a long time. And if you don't have that many days, well, now we do. So you can easily grow sweet potatoes in Delaware, where 50 years ago you may not have been able to do that. Another good thing that you can try, succession planting. I do this with lettuce a lot. Lettuce does not like the heat. Most lettuces. There are some that will tolerate it, but most lettuces don't like the heat. They will bolt or go to seed once it gets too hot. So you can plant a crop earlier in the spring, and then once it goes to seed, you can take it out, plant something else, or just let your ground rest. And then when it cools off, starts to cool off at the end of the summer, you can have a second crop. So I do this every year. So again, I said it's easier to grow things that you might not have thought about growing before, things that like hotter weather or that like wetter weather. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. Intercropping. If you want to grow more in your garden in less space, intercropping is where you can grow two different things next to each other, like something that's taller next to something that doesn't grow as high, that might need a little bit of shade, and the taller crop will help shade the shorter crop. In addition, some crops like root vegetables have deeper roots, and you can intercrop those with things that have shallow roots, so they're not taking their water and nutrients at the same level, and you can actually put them closer than what the label on the package might say that you can do. Another thing you want to think about is not to plant. When I started gardening, I planted only tomatoes. My whole garden was tomatoes. But if you have only one thing that you're growing and you get a disease or an insect infestation on that, what happens? You lose it all. So if you have a variety of different things and you lose one of those, you still have something left in your garden to harvest and eat. So also with the events of climate change, excessive heat. Remember and make sure that you don't put your garden too close to asphalt or concrete walks. This really, really, really heats up your garden. And you might have some problems with your plants just dying because they're too hot. They do make shade cloths that you can use to shade your garden, or row covers, different kinds of covers. You can give them a little bit of shade. And another good thing is to put some trees in your garden. Even small trees will help provide some shade, or maybe some fruiting shrubs that intermixed in your garden. And another thing you can think about doing is growing some things indoors. I am actually planning on doing a workshop in the winter on growing indoors with hydroponics. I've been growing hydroponically for quite a while now, and I think I'm about ready to put something together and share some of those with you. I grow greens in my kitchen 365 days a year, so I always, always have fresh salad, whether it's cold outside or whether it's too hot outside. I always have that available because I can do that indoors. So water, controlling your water use. So we have two things that can happen. You can have not enough water in the case of a drought, or you can have too much water in case of excessive rain and flooding. So to save water, one of the things you want to do is avoid over irrigating, because all that extra water either runs off or evaporates. If you have an irrigation system, it's really important to run that the best time is early in the morning. I run mine just before dawn. That way the water has a chance to soak into the soil and be absorbed before the sun comes up to evaporate it. And also, it also helps prevent excess water laying on your crops or your lawns and creating a condition that promotes fungal disease growth. So the best time to water your lawn is early in the morning. you also don't want to water it in the hottest part of the day, in the middle of the afternoon, because when you do that, you are losing as much as 30% of that water because it's just evaporating right back into the air. So try, if you're going to irrigate, try to do it early in the morning. If you are getting a lot of rain, you can think about getting a rain barrel to collect and store that water. I use mine all the time. Mine has a little spigot, so instead of turning my hose on, I go to my spigot and fill my watering can from my rain barrel to make use of that water that I've collected to water my containers and things. Mulch helps to keep the water, the moisture in your soil from evaporating. Leaf mulch is getting to be very popular. It's easy to make your own if you have trees where the leaves fall in the autumn. You can put those in a trash can and use a weed whacker and chop them up and make your own leaf mulch. You can also buy that. So that's really a good natural organic mulch that will help keep the moisture in your soil. We're going to talk about this in a minute. Choosing plants that tolerate a drier soil condition or a wetter soil condition. So read those plant labels. If your lawn is getting really, really dry and you don't have irrigation, look for plants that you can plant that like dry soil. And there's a lot of those out there. I mean, if you've ever been out west, you see them everywhere. Cacti, and I've seen down at the beach yucca plants growing. I think that yuccas are awesome. So, and another thing you can do is think about creating a rain garden. So basically in a rain garden, you're going to have an area at least 10 feet away from your house where you can divert water from your downspouts using pipes or underground tubes or above ground method to create a space that might have been dry that you can collect the water that comes out of your downspout and create a rain garden. We're not going to go into all that detail here, but as we were just talking about before we started here, this is a potential workshop that we might be able to do in the future if anybody is interested. So whether you're planting ornamental plants or a vegetable garden, just think of yourself as being in zone 8 instead of zone 7 or one zone higher. And look for plants that are heat tolerant. Look for plants that are drought tolerant. And there's a lot of them out there. Greenhouses and seed producers are coming up with more and more hybrid plants that are bred to tolerate certain conditions. There are salt tolerant plants, even salt tolerant vegetables. Plants that can tolerate wet feet, in other words, being in very wet or standing water in the soil. And look for plants that have a longer growing season, like we said earlier. Plants that need more days to produce. And here's a little chart I put together. I did some research on vegetables and fruits that can tolerate certain extreme conditions. So you see here, heat tolerant. The number one thing is sweet potatoes. I went to Canada for 3 weeks and I came back, and the best thing in my garden that's doing the best after being completely neglected for 3 weeks are those sweet potatoes. I know we did get some rain while I was gone, but they can tolerate heat, and they don't need, once they're established, they don't need as much water as most things in your garden. Spinach, we had a question in a previous workshop that we did about there's people who are having their spinach bolt too fast. That's a problem when it gets hot. Your spinach, like your lettuce, will bolt. Spinach does not like heat, but they've come up with some new tropical spinach that's been developed that will tolerate heat. I wrote down the names of some of those. Tropical spinach varieties, Malabar, Okinawa, and Longevity are tropical spinach varieties. Also, there are a few varieties that they call slow bolt, which means that they will grow in hotter weather before they bolt, but they will bolt. And that is Corinta, Spinner, Tai, Indian Summer, Steadfast, and the most popular one around here that I've seen is Bloomsdale. Those are better at being slower to bolt. Also, some good heat tolerant crops. Think the South. Okra is a good heat tolerant crop. Eggplant, tomatillas, I like to grow those. If you don't know what those are similar to tomatoes. They're in the same family. They are green, and that's what they make that green salsa out of that you get in your Mexican dishes. There's also been a new variety of tomatoes recently developed called heat wave tomatoes, and those will tolerate more heat. Cowpeas, which include black-eyed peas and field peas, are more heat tolerant. They also have the added benefit of being nitrogen fixers, so you can alternate those with some other crops. Maybe put your lettuce in, and when you take your lettuce out, put in some peas, cowpeas types, and then that will replenish the nitrogen in your soil. So you get multiple benefits from that. Hot peppers grow well in the heat. And then you have your drought tolerant figs. I know a couple of different people who grow figs, and they say it's been a great year for figs. They're getting overrun with figs. So with a drier summer, I believe that they've said that some people in Delaware have had, the figs are doing well. Grapes are also drought tolerant. Excuse me. I intend on planting a variety of grapes next. When they're dormant in the winter, end of winter, called muscadine. If you've ever heard of those are popular in the South. I grew up in Georgia. We had them everywhere. This is a native grape, and it's also drought tolerant. Lavender is an herb that likes dry soil. Mustard greens, lima beans, goji berries, rhubarb, and persimmons are all drought tolerant crops. And then we'll go to the water tolerant. These are things that can tolerate wetter soil. Cauliflower, garden peas, celery, mint. Mint tolerates anything as far as I can tell in my experience. Peanuts, I did grow peanuts one year. Watercress, asparagus, and black chokeberries all don't mind being overly wet. And then if you do live near the coast where you might have a problem with salt in your water, these are more salt tolerant crops that can be grown. Beets, bell peppers, broccoli, spinach, tomatoes, amazingly enough, cabbage, and kale will tolerate saltier soils. In addition to looking at what they tolerate, we know that in Delaware, fungus is a huge problem this time of year. You really can't avoid it. You can try to prevent it, but it's a big job to try to prevent that fungus. Once you have it, it's pretty much impossible to get rid of it. So the biggest recommendation of what you can do is look for crops that are resistant to fungus. So look at those labels. If you see, this is tomatoes, you'll often see a label on a tomato package that says VFN resistant. So this means it's resistant to verticillium wilt and fusarium, both of which are fungal diseases, and also nematodes, which is actually a little tiny worm that's in the soil. So if you look for those labels and look for packages that are where things are resistant, these growers, they want to sell their seeds, so they're working hard to produce hybrid types of seeds that are more resistant to not only fungi, but also heat, drought, water, all these other things. So read the packets and keep an eye out for those new varieties of seeds and plants. All right, I want to talk about blueberries for a minute because I've grown blueberries for 30-something years. I grew them in Georgia. I grew southern high bush blueberries. The kind that are typically grown in Delaware right now and places north are northern high bush blueberries. And this is really all about chill hours. So they're two separate varieties. The southern high bush are actually a hybrid created from mixing the northern high bush with the native rabbit eye that grows in the south. The southern The advantages of the southern over the northern, another advantage is they are more resistant to pests and diseases than the northern high bush. But the important thing is chill hours. So what a chill hour is it's calculated by counting the number of hours at or below 45 degrees Fahrenheit from October 1st through November 28th. So basically through the fall and winter. How many hours we have where it's less than 45 degrees or 45 degrees. So I looked that up for Dover, Delaware. And in Dover, Delaware, this past winter, we had about 1,467 chill hours. But, with climate change, you can foresee that that number may go down. Well, northern high bush blueberries need from between 800 and 1,000 chill hours to produce. So right now they should be okay. But the southern high bush, they only need between 150 and 800 chill hours to produce. So how does this affect the way blueberries grow? So in order for them to bloom and produce fruit, they have an internal clock and it lets them know when to bloom. So after the right amount of cold hours, the warm day indicates to them that they're ready to start blooming. But if they haven't had enough hours of chilling, it holds off on blooming because it's thinking that it's going to get cold again and I'm going to get frost and I'm going to lose my blooms. So it waits. And if it waits, then you have late blooming and you may not have enough time to produce a crop. Also, if it doesn't get cold enough, it's not going to bloom at all. It's never going to come out. So that's why you have to look at chill hours. And chill hours don't only affect blueberries. They affect a lot of fruits. Persimmons, almonds, olives, berries, and pomegranates have low chilling requirements. And there are also special varieties of apples, pears, apricots, nectarines, peaches, and plums that have been bred to require less chill hours. So if you're thinking of planting any of these fruits, make sure you pay attention to the chill hours. And again, right now in Dover, we're getting about 1,467. So keep an eye on that because we don't want to invest all that money in our fruits just to have them not produce anything. Okay, another very, very important thing. If you want to help yourself at home and the climate, think about planting more trees. They do help keep you cooler. If you have some trees that shade parts of your house, this will help on your cooling bills. And it will also shade your garden and your lawn from excess heat. A lot of the grasses that we grow in Delaware, the cool season grasses, if you're not irrigating them, they will burn up. But if you look in a shady spot, you'll notice that your grass does a lot better when it gets a little bit more shade. So another good thing, of course, you know this, that trees take in carbon dioxide and they will help absorb. They're great because they help unpollute the air. They take those pollutants and those carbon compounds that are floating around out there that are creating these greenhouse gases and help clean the air. And another good benefit of trees, especially native trees, is they do bloom, even though you may not always see them, and those are host to a lot of our native insects. So I want to focus on the oak tree right now. So if anybody's ever read any of Doug Tallamy's books, he has one out there on the nature of oaks. And I did peruse some of that book to come up with some ideas of things about oak. I love these trees. They are awesome because they have a huge canopy, so they will provide a lot of nice quality shade. They also are excellent at blocking wind. And another good thing is if you're getting hard torrential rains, the large canopies will help intercept that rainwater so it's not pounding down on your soil and washing it away and eroding so much. So that's another good feature of these oak trees. Again, they host many native insects, lots and lots of them. They produce acorns that will sustain our wildlife, feed our wildlife through the winter. And the really cool thing about oaks and hardwood is that with when trees are hardwood trees, they actually absorb carbon more slowly, but they'll absorb it over a longer period of time because they're longer lived. So if you have a short-lived tree that absorbs carbon really fast, it's not going to be as effective in the long run as something like an oak that will absorb it more slowly and consistently over a longer period of time. And there's a lot of research been done on oaks that's really interesting that I was reading this very statistical study that oaks are it's been discovered that they are increasing their rate of photosynthesis, and they're adapting on their own to the effects of climate change. So they're increasing they're sucking the carbon out of the air at a faster rate. And they're expected to increase that by a third by 2050. The other cool thing about oaks is they have been found to be able to adapt to climate change better than many other trees. Oaks and pines are doing really well in adapting. They are, moving north like most stuff, but oaks, you have oaks everywhere. You have oaks in the south, oaks in the north. So they have been found that they can survive and adapt to climate change as long as we can keep them protected, because there are some diseases out there. There's one called sudden oak death. That's been a problem, oak wilt, and oat leaf scorch, and also the gypsy moths. The gypsy moths, if we can contain them, we need to work on saving our oak trees because they are one of the best trees out there to help us with climate change. And speaking of trees, here's another one that is not doing so well. So stock up on your maple syrup now because we may have shortages in the future. The problem with maple trees, sugar maples that are actually being used mostly in the north to produce that maple syrup, they have to have certain conditions in order to make the syrup flow. So what they need some really, really cold nights, and then in the daytime they need temperatures to get up below freezing. And this is what causes that sap to flow, and they can collect it and make your maple syrup. So the problem is with it warming up, this is shifting earlier, or it's just totally disrupted their cycle. So they're not the weather hasn't been right, and the high and low temperatures haven't been right to make them produce. Like I said, in my property in Canada, we wanted to plant a lot of sugar maples, which we did plant some. We're trying, but they say that they're discouraging that because all their sugar maples are dying. What's happening is the sugar maples, as they try to move north, they're finding that the pH of the soil and the types of soils that are north of where they're now growing aren't the right types of soils for maples to grow in. So they just can't go any farther. Also, as you can see here, less snow causes damage to the roots and is reducing the tree shoots. So, like I said, stock up on your maple syrup because they are seeing a decline in those trees. Okay, now we're going to talk lawns. I know you've heard this before. Lawns are not the best use of your land. I know they're pretty and nice and make you think that you have really good property values and stuff like that. But if you can think about, or you're trying to replacing part of the grassy areas in your lawn with a bed of native plants, this is a really effective solution to mitigating climate change because the beds of native plants can reduce runoff. It can also help filter that water. Native plants are traditionally require less watering because they have deeper roots, and they're also well adapted to your local soil conditions. So they don't need as much watering, so that saves water. And then they also are adapted to your soil, so they don't really need to be fertilized. So you save money on fertilizer, you save money on watering, and you don't have to, once they're established, they don't need a lot of maintenance. They kind of do their own thing. I know they're not that pretty in the wintertime, but um, you know that's what we do. And also a little footnote in here that a lot of the fertilizers that you use on your lawns, especially the ones that are used on farms and farming and crops, contain nitrous oxide. So you've got these nitrogen fertilizers like urea, not natural urea, but artificially produced urea, and the ammonium fertilizers. Those actually are not, especially if you over fertilize, they're not all absorbed by your lawns. They are going up into evaporating into the atmosphere, and they are actually accounting for 7% of the greenhouse gas emissions. I know that's not a high percent, but this particular gas is actually much harder, much worse on the ozone layer than carbon. So, and the other thing is, if you're going to fertilize your lawn, do it in the fall. In the fall, you're feeding the roots. It's not necessary to feed your lawn in the spring. I have neighbors that drive me crazy because they're out there fertilizing their lawns like every month, and that's just really, it's just a big waste. It wastes money, and it also contributes to greenhouse gases. So again, I wanted to encourage everybody to think about planting at least some native plants. In addition to the other things that we have just mentioned about requiring less water and less fertilizer, they also are great for attracting our native pollinators. And we are trying to desperately save our native pollinators. In this case, I want to point out the rusty patched bumblebee. I don't know if you've heard, but this bumblebee has recently been added to the endangered species list. It's protected under the Endangered Species Act because it is going extinct. It used to be around everywhere. There were a lot of them, and they have decreased. And what do they pollinate? Wildflowers and food. Cranberries, plums, apples, alfalfa, and onion blossoms. So this bee is kind of unique. It has a short tongue, and sometimes it'll poke a hole in the back of the flower. So it's good at pollinating things that other bees may not be accessing the same way. So I am going to be doing a workshop in October on native bees. So hopefully you'll look for that and join us for that one too. So some of the data here: one in the 6 of native bee species is regionally extinct of the 4,000 bee species that we have. And 23% of the native bees are declining. And what happens if we have no bees? Things don't get pollinated. When some of these blooms and crops don't get pollinated, then they don't produce any fruits or vegetables. Okay, now we're going to talk about compost. So I never really thought about this before, but I recently read an article that there's a program that they started in, I believe it's in Los Angeles, where you are not allowed to throw your kitchen scraps into the trash. And they found that the landfills, all this stuff goes into landfills, and it's in trash bags and thrown in there loose and everything else. It's not composting in there with all that other trash. It's just lying in there, and it's actually producing greenhouse gases as it quickly sits in there and rots. So they want to help. In California, they started a program. They are doing curbside collection of compost, which I think of kitchen scraps, which I think would be awesome if anybody wants to looking for a business to start in Delaware. Think about starting a commercial composting company where you can actually have people put their kitchen scraps out, and then you can compost that and then provide the compost back to the community. I would love to be involved in something like that. So composting, we're not going to go into a lot of details of how to compost here. We have other workshops for that. But when you do make your own compost, you save money because you don't have to go out and buy fertilizers, all those different fertilizers. You use your compost, properly composted materials, and use that in your gardens, and you will not have to go out and buy fertilizers. I fertilize my garden completely with my own compost. Another thing that awesome about compost is when you add it to your soil, it helps the soil retain water on one hand, but if your soil gets too wet, it also helps mixed in with the soil. It also helps manage drainage, helps your soil to drain better. So it does works on both ends. You have to have that perfect balance of organic matter in there, which if you've done a soil test, I believe for vegetable gardens, somewhere around 6%. If you look at your soil test results, you can aim for that. Okay, and pretty much last but not least, I want to talk about microclimates. This is something that you can investigate yourself. So you can walk around your yard and make note, where are the wet spots of your yard? Where are the hot spots? Where are the dry spots? Where does it have more shade? Where is it shadier? You can make notes of that, maybe even draw a map of your yard, noting different temperatures and different soils in different parts of your yard. And then you can work with that. You can grow what does well in that particular microclimate. So I have areas near trees that get more shade, and I try to put my lettuces there because they can tolerate more shade. Herbs and lettuces can tolerate more shade. A lot of herbs can tolerate drier soil. So if you want to grow herbs, think about looking in your yard for a spot where it gets maybe a little bit more shade, or it's a little bit drier, and plant your herbs there. Of course, we all know we can't plant the same thing in the same spot every year because that depletes the soil. It's not good for that. We need to rotate our crops. But you can still find enough variety of different things that grow in those same conditions. And what are some other things you can do? If you're environmentally concerned, as I am, you can think about volunteering at food banks. You can volunteer to help in community gardens. You can become a master gardener and volunteer to teach other people and help other people with their gardens. You can think about starting a community garden. If you're really good at growing tomatoes and your neighbor down the street is really good at growing bell peppers, then you can create a community garden together where everybody can do their own thing, and then you can all share and benefit from that. So we do have a couple of community gardens in the Dover area that we can think about doing something like that. Or if you live in a neighborhood and you want to start a neighborhood community garden. If you're growing your own food and you have extra food, donate it. There's people out there who don't have the ability to have a garden. Donate it to the food bank or to your any other of your organizations that you may belong to, and share that extra food instead of letting it go to waste. Learn to preserve your food. Learn to can or to dehydrate your food. Learn to freeze, how to properly freeze your food so that you can preserve it and have that food available all year around, and not just think that summer's over and I'm not going to get any more food from my garden. There's ways to save that. So learn. I know there's been a lot of classes. I think the master food educators often put out classes on preserving food and that kind of thing. So look for that. Think about eating less meat. Not only is it healthier to eat less meat, it's also actually better for the environment. The all these animals out here, these cattle and pigs and things, they produce a lot of methane. If you've ever driven by a farm that's packed with cattle, you don't even need to look. You can smell it. So that is a really huge contributor to greenhouse gases. So if people would eat less meat, then there wouldn't be as much of a need for cattle out there. It is healthier. I know we need our protein, but there are a lot of vegetables that have a lot of protein in them that you can eat, and especially beans and peas contain a lot of protein. So think about just cutting back. I'm not asking you to eliminate it if you don't want to. Just think about cutting back and eating less meats. Another thing you can think about doing is if you want to protect the native bees, build a bee house or a bee nest box. We are going to be doing this in my workshop. So if you want to sign up for my workshop, we're going to let you go home with your own bee house. So this is awesome because the native bees need a place to hang out over the winter to pupate or to rest. And if you can have your own bee house and you can keep those pollinators in your garden, they'll stay there and pollinate for the next year. And another thing is if you have kids, get your kids interested in gardening and teach them how to be sustainable, because they're the ones that are going to have to deal with the worst of everything that's going on in the future. And that is all I have for you today. I have sent you a list of, well, actually more resources than this that I have here. So you already have that information.